Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who are here this morning, welcome back. For those of you who have just joined us this afternoon, welcome. Hope that have you all had a chance to see the degree show? Did you chat to people and see the work during the lunch break? And hopefully you foraged for food successfully. So this morning we were looking from the inside out, from presentations from some of our graduating students from the MA Art and Science. And this afternoon, we're flipping that. We've invited some external speakers who all have very sterling track records in working across disciplinary fields to share their perspectives and to engage in conversation. We asked them to focus on certain aspects, so the value of interdisciplinary practice, institutional contexts, and the future of polymathic practices. So we'll hear what they have to say about that. So it will be presentations from each of the three speakers, Oron Katz, Rachel Armstrong, and Eve Mitleton-Kelly, convened by Rob La Frenais, who I'll introduce and hand over to in a moment. So each of them will present for the 15 minutes, then they'll have a discussion, and then we'll open it up to the floor. We should finish around 4 o'clock for some drinks in the canteen across the way. So I'd like to hand over to Rob, who's going to convene this afternoon's session. So Rob La Frenais is an independent curator with nearly 30 years' experience under his belt. He's well known for his work with Arts Catalyst. He worked with as the key curator for 17 years. And has curated exceptional international projects, which I think Rob will talk a little bit about now, and about what he's doing post-Arts Catalyst. So I'll hand over to Rob, and he can introduce our speakers. Rob La Frenais.
Hello everyone, welcome to Unfolding Realities Part 2. I'll be your moderator for the afternoon. I hope we get from start to finish. We all stay awake and head for the drinks, enlivened and intellectually stimulated. Just a little word about myself. I'm not going to show a presentation. I've actually got a presentation in my top pocket, just in case. But all the speakers are here and correct, so I won't have to show you that. I'm just going to literally tell you what I'm doing right now, which is I'm working and curating in southwest France in the beautiful Vallée du Lot, the Lot Valley, a project called Exoplanet Lot, which is a number of international artists who are imagining the Lot Valley as an Earth-like planet where technology, art and science have forked into different paths, and that's working with the artist Tania Candiani, who represented Mexico at the Venice Biennale last year, the artist and designer group from Paris, Hey Hey, Thomas Las Bougies, Caroline Meirote, the writer Tracy Waugh, who's doing a new science fiction novel based in the Lot Valley called Meander, which you'll be able to read as you walk through the valley and follow the river. So I've just come from that, and I think, I'm not sure if Heather mentioned the last project I did with Thomas Saraceno, which is kind of relevant to the unfolding of reality in that it questions what we currently think about in terms of space travel, firing extremely unsustainable rockets up into the atmosphere. And we did a very large project in White Sands Desert showing that you could go into space with balloons possibly powered by the sun. And then finally, just to say that, just to mark the date in your diary, I'm following on from my work with the Arts Catalyst with an exhibition about art and science called No Such Thing as Gravity, which will be opening in fact Liverpool on November the 10th, which works with artists and scientists to investigate the limits of scientific knowledge rather than celebrate the differences or the similarities. We'll be talking about what scientists don't know, and I see Sarah Sparks in the audience, who's going to be in that show creating ghosts scientifically. Anyway, so that's me. Let me go on to our first speaker. So Oron Katz is an extremely good speaker, and I hope he'll be on form after an extremely long journey direct from Australia to this room. Oron is the director of Symbiotica, the Centre of Excellence in Biological Arts, School of Anatomy, Physiology and Human Biology at the University of Western Australia. And I first came across him in Australia, where I attended the very first art and biology workshop in Adelaide. The first, what they called bioarts, but I think, are we rejecting the word bioart today, or we're going with the word bioart? Okay, the first bioart workshop, and then continued with him along with Yashas Shetty at Srishti School of Science Srishti School of Art, Media and Design in Bangalore, and the National Centre for Biological Sciences in India to do the very first bioart workshop in India, and then finally here, all of this within the context of the Arts Catalyst, here in London to do the first ever artists workshop on synthetic biology at UCL. Cynthia, was it called? Yes. Synthesis. That Cynthia was the word that we weren't allowed to use. Synthesis was the word it turned out to be. That was to get the Wellcome Trust money, I believe. Okay. And Oron is also probably the only professor of contestable design at the Royal College of Arts, London, and also a visiting professor at the School of Art, Design and Architecture of Aalto University, Helsinki. And Oron also sacrifices worms in the name of ethics. That's the last thing I'm going to say about Oron, because I'm sure he can stand up for himself and his line on interdisciplinary subjects between art, science, and ethics. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. It's really, really good to be here, and thank you, Heather, for inviting me. I always wanted to see what Nathan would come out with the art and science program, because Nathan was in that synthesis workshop, and that's where we met for the first time. And I met Heather, actually. You missed one really important workshop, which was back in 2003 or 4, with some of the luminaries of art and science here in King's College, which was people like Franco B and Heather and which was
College, yes,
yes,
indeed.
we really want to do a reunion, so we need to figure out.
And Wim Delvoye, Jens Hauser,
and Franco B.
Very important.
Yeah.
So
anyway,
there's always too much in our lives.
Yes.
It just becomes too overcrowded.
Anyway, so it's really interesting because from my perspective, and I was asked to talk about kind of the institutional area of art and science, but for a large extent, for me, it's a mute question because 20 years ago, I entered the lab as an artist, and I never looked back. And 17 years ago, I got funding to set up an institution, which we called Symbiotica, at the School of Anatomy. Actually, at the time, it was the Department of Anatomy and Human Biology at the University of Western Australia. And the reason why we set up Symbiotica was to allow artistic research to take place within a biological context. And we're so integrated in this science school that we're part of that I don't really feel the need to justify art and science collaboration in any way or form. Actually, I feel the need to maintain what I refer to as the integrity of disciplines. So I hope you'll kind of follow up with that. But from my perspective, there's something which is really interesting. It's happening, and it's happened more than 100 years ago, but it's now being pushed to degrees that I think we all need to pay attention to, and that's the fact that biology is becoming engineering. And for me as an artist, my interest was always the question of life, not so much science, but what's happening to life, how our relationship to life is changing and shifting, and what happens when life is becoming a raw material to us to engineer. So I wrote a thesis back in 1996 as part of my design degree, where I was looking at a future in which design and biotechnology might come together. As I mentioned in a conference last year in New York, where startup companies that are now employing designers in the context of biotechnology were trying to meet investors to try and generate this field, what I was thinking about 20 years ago, my dream of design interacting with biotechnology, is now becoming a nightmare. and we can talk more about it maybe in the conversation later on. So I came up with something which I suppose now can be considered to be a speculative design project, where I was trying to figure out what it means to start to design living biological systems, how our relationship to the made environment would change, what happens if we are changing the culture of manufacturing to a culture of growing, and is it going to be good or not? And as I was working on this project, I realized that there's so many more questions that need to be asked that I decided to continue my project as an artist rather than a designer, setting up the Tissue Culture and Art Project in 1996 to try and engage with those very same questions that I felt need to be addressed. I see myself, by definition, as a problem seeker. I'm not trying to solve any problems in the world. I'm actually trying to identify where the problems exist and how we can kind of engage with them in a way that actually makes sense. So as I mentioned, 4 years after I set up the Tissue Culture and Art Project with my collaborator, Yonat Zur, and we started to work in the School of Anatomy and Physiology and Human Biology, I realized that the power relationship between myself as an artist and the scientific world that I operated in needs some improvement. I felt that I constantly was in a position of the guest that asks favor, and I constantly had to pay back in ways that I wasn't really interested in. So I had to design horrible posters and websites and do the kind of stuff that artists often need to do in order to satisfy the access to the resources, those very limited resources that the scientists, by their grace and will, would somehow give to the artists. And I felt that's not the way to do it. So the reason I was so interested in setting up Symbiotica was to set up a research lab where the artistic research into the questions of the life sciences would become as valid as the scientific research around us. And I was really, really lucky. I got funding together with two scientists, Professor Miranda Grounds and Dr. Stuart Bunt, to be able to build a physical space where artists can come in, and from that to expand and develop this model that we now call Symbiotica. Interesting enough, also in the context of that, for the first 3 or 4 years, I wasn't paid by the university to establish the program, which meant that I didn't have to promise anything to the university, which meant that I didn't need to use those rhetorics that are often being used in this context of art and science, especially in the current climate of innovation and some kind of measuring the impact of art and science collaboration in what I refer to as secondary, looking at the secondary outcomes that can be monetized. That wasn't ever part of what we were trying to do at Symbiotica. It was very rarely used by us as a way to promote and basically develop the program. And I think this is the reason why we exist for the last 17 years. While I've seen so many of those initiatives come and go, and to a large extent because of this misalignment of expectations between what the artists are interested in doing and what the expectations are that they would yield in the end, which is usually can be measured in terms of IP and so-called innovation. So our interest was always to research the idea of life. And it so happens that the most radical shifts in the way we treat life and relate to life happens within the context of the science and the engineering realm. And that's why we parked ourselves there. So we try to culturally articulate and provide this new language which doesn't really exist. And this is something that I hit myself time and time again by trying to figure out what kind of language we can use in order to describe our newfound relationship to life. And I would claim that there's a growing gap between our cultural understanding of life and to a large extent even the way we evolved as biological beings to relate to life. So this gap between that and what we're starting to know about life through science, but even more importantly, what we choose to do to life through engineering and technology. I talk about it in terms of the fact that the scientists and the engineers are digging ontological holes. They basically fundamentally question what it means to be alive. The fundamental questions of our existence, our being as biological entities, is constantly being assaulted by what's happening in the science and the engineering labs. But with all due respect to the scientists and the engineers, they don't really have the tools to even recognize what they're doing in this context. And this is where I see the role that artists can play. So we're trying to identify those areas of those shifting perceptions of life. We do it through basically reading scientific literature, seeing those areas that we feel need more cultural attention, more cultural scrutiny. we explore those possibilities in order to propose alternative directions and initiate cultural debate. As I mentioned, we're not utilitarian. Our lab is not trying to find a cure for cancer. We're not trying to make the world a better place. We're trying to figure out what's wrong with the world at the moment and what's wrong with the way we treat life and how we can then project those things in ways of contestable futures, and the creation of evocative objects in order to question this whole relationship that we have with life. And by definition, when we engage with it in such a way, we reflect on the ethical issues that surround our relationship to life. We look specifically at what we refer to as the zone of uncomfort, those areas that make us feel really uncomfortable, because we know that those are exactly those areas that we don't have this cultural language to talk about what we're doing to life. And the model that we developed in Symbiotica that seems to now expand a lot is we do it through this direct experiential engagement. What we're interested in is getting the artist into the lab for them to engage in the most experiential way with those different modes of manipulation of life. And there's quite a few reasons for that. We heard about embedded cognition, the idea of the body being in the lab, engaging with life in the most intimate, fundamental way is a very different experience than just reading about it or looking over a scientist's shoulder. You actually engage with it. You're also implicated in that. So in a sense, you can't be self-righteous. You can't just say, look at those horrible scientists that are doing those horrible things to living systems. You're doing it yourself as a way to create those contestable objects or those contestable scenarios. And you have a much better understanding of the possibilities because there's so much bullshit in this world at the moment regarding unrealistic expectations of what biological systems can provide us. I would claim that quite a lot of the things that are now being discussed in the context of biology is like physicists talking about a world without gravity. What we see now, we see a huge economic, and we can talk about it later maybe in the conversation, we see a huge economic push to use biological systems because they're so seductive and they so fit a neoliberal agenda of eternal growth, at the very same time that the actual biological systems don't yield the type of results that seem to be promised to us. So, in a sense, by being in the lab, you actually are becoming more aware of the limitations of those technologies. And rather than engaging in speculative propositions of the future of unrealistic biological impossibilities, you engage with the actualities of the biological. And I think this is an extremely important thing. So, just in other words, so we explore the philosophical idea of the shifting perceptions of life. We identify and develop new materials. So, in a sense, by what the scientists and the engineers provide us is a new palette for artistic manipulation. So, by life becoming a raw material to be engineered, we also, by definition, creating a new way to engage with the very materiality of life, which wasn't very possible before. And we do so in a way that actually now, using what the engineers and the scientists have been developed to develop new way to engage with the very object and the subject of our investigation, and that's life itself. And then we're trying to figure out what it means to put living biological systems within a cultural context. The difficulties, and we heard about it earlier today, what does it mean to put biohazards in a cultural space or in a public space? What does it mean to have a bioreactor that has living tissue in it in a museum? Now, museums, by definition, have been designed for centuries to keep dead things as dead as possible for as long as possible. What does it mean to put something living that actually change over time within the context of the museum? How curators, how conservators can come to terms with that is an ongoing struggle. So we are doing quite a lot of research into that. Oh, wow, already. And we also have what we refer to as the enabling technologies, where we actually develop our own technologies, because sometimes the requests and the needs of the artists into those technologies are very different than what we can get from scientific equipment. So at Symbiotica, we develop those following kind of streams. So we have academic courses, we run exhibitions, we have a residency program. So since the year 2000, we had more than 100 residents doing many different projects. And we do, in order to fulfill the box-ticking exercise of universities, but also out of interest, we run symposiums, seminars, and workshops. Our Masters of Biological Arts, which we refer to as the real MBA, the useful one, as opposed to all of the other stuff that is out there, is the only one of its kind. It's a science degree in biological arts. Our master students, I suppose, quite similar to what's happening here. They pick up scientific programs as well as artistic units, and then they develop research projects for the second year of their masters. Exhibitions, so I won't go through that, but just, for example, last year I curated a show that looked at the 20th anniversary of the first public appearance of the mouse with the human neurons back, and I was looking at the cultural impact of that image, because from my perspective, that was one of the most important images of the late 20th century, and it was developed by scientists with a very little understanding of the wider cultural impact of this image. So I went and interviewed the scientists and interrogated them to see if there's any kind of art historical references. Why an ear, why a mouse, why this combination, why the creation of basically the surrealist dream was eventuated and materialized in the lab rather than the studio. Another conference, workshops, we talk about the workshops, residencies. So we have a wide range. We see ourselves as an artistic research lab that deals with questions around life from the submolecular to the ecological. So we had a wide range of, this is just a very limited kind of taxonomy of the areas of engagement of some of the residents. It was much wider than that, but basically from the submolecular to the ecological. My own area of interest is tissue engineering, and that's where I started, mainly inspired by the mouse with neurons back and wanted to further my research into that. But I suppose because of the time limit, so what, we've got a minute or so, I'll just leave those questions for you. What are we dealing with now in the context of life, not so much science? What we see now is that technology is becoming more lifelike. We're getting more and more technological objects that operate almost like living systems. Life becoming more technology-like. At the very same time that we allow our technologies autonomy, we even give our technology a license to kill, to make decisions about who would live and who would die, in the sense of killer drones, or even questions like what an autonomous car, who's going to run over, what kind of decisions, what kind of ethical algorithms we're going to give our autonomous technology. At the very same time that we do that, we're trying to assert our control over other living systems. Now, trying to assert your control over any other life form, by definition, is an act of violence. And I'll finish here. Thank you.
So, Oron, you came in on 1 minute 30 seconds early. So, any burning questions? We're going to have a Q&A afterwards, but I'm sure people have got any. He's got a minute and a half to answer your burning questions. You're cowed into submission, and there must be something. Okay, let me just pick up on this last. This thing here, technology becoming more lifelike and life becoming more technology-like. Can you expand on that a bit? I think that's quite an extraordinary dichotomy.
It is. You can see it. So Japan is a great example. So in Japan, because of the aging population, they need to figure out who's going to look after the older people that need to be looked after. Because Japan doesn't believe in immigration, like I suppose half of you here in the room, they don't want to get younger people to support the looking after the elders. So they're trying to develop robots that would engage with the elderly people in a way which is very similar to caring relationship that one might have with a carer, with a caregiver. So this is kind of on the human level of the relationship. So they're trying to develop technology which is more lifelike in that sense. But in other ways, as I was referring to, we are developing autonomous systems that respond in a very lifelike way to the... That's me stopping now?
Oh, that's your alarm.
Yeah. You see, we have our external memories, we have our external time-keeping systems.
Life has become more technology-like.
Exactly, and we're being determined by that. But we'll come back to this question, I suppose, in the conversation. So, thank you.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so we're going to keep the times totally strictly technologically rather than human controlled here. So just to point that out, so it's all fair. Great pleasure to introduce somebody who I haven't worked with for a long time, but really was very, very interested in catching up with, is Rachel Armstrong, who is the Professor of Experimental Architecture at the Department of Architecture, Planning and Landscape at Newcastle University. He's also a 2010 Senior TED Fellow. Rachel is probably the only person I know in the world who can combine being a doctor, an architect, a science fiction writer, and it says here a circus performer.
I can barely tie my shoelaces.
Rachel actually, I worked with Rachel a very long time ago. We worked together on a fairly groundbreaking conference called Eye of the Storm at the Royal Institution.
That was awesome.
Yeah,
that was really
which
awesome.
had some quite amazing names in, including Sir Roger Penrose, Stelarc, to name but
It was extraordinary.
two, and the creator of Dolly the Sheep, whose name
Yes, Ian Roslin.
Roslin, and we had a massive controversy that nearly caused the Royal Institution and Susan Greenfield,
Just your average event, that Rob organises.
with an explicit sex film and all sorts of other things. So it was a great experience working with you, Rachel. Let's find out what you've been doing since.
Not all of that was my fault.
Sorry, what?
I was saying not all of that was my fault.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm really looking forward to hearing about all of this. Just let me say once more, I was a little late this morning because I got caught up reading the blog of the Rauschenberg Residency, the Rising Waters that you've just come back from.
Yeah.
So it looked absolutely fascinating environment to be living and working in. And so that's
really special. I've thrown a few slides together for that.
great,
so
excellent,
just,
good. Okay, so take it away, Rachel.
Thank you. Well, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to plunge straight into it because I realise that time's going to run out. And I'd like to talk about, is there a way of changing the images over? I'm going to talk about the institution of knowledge very quickly. And that is that we are living at a time that's, I'm not going to claim Oron's pictures, there we go, it should be us. But essentially I want to talk about the state of knowledge right now. So when we're invited to talk about institutions, I kind of want to talk about the role of the university and its situation in relationship to the way that we think we know. Because the university is really an enlightenment structure that, we're currently in a second phase of, let's say, knowledge acquisition within the institution of the university. The first forms of knowledge, obviously, were religious. Now we're in a phase in which, Enlightenment thinking, and particularly, through the course of the 19th century, we have the role of the institutions, the royal societies, which start to validate disciplinary practices in certain ways. And I think it would be unfair to not acknowledge our relationship of knowing in relationship to the institutions in which our practices are situated. I won't say too much about it, but obviously the form of Enlightenment thinking that I'm talking about has given rise to modernity and is around about 500 years old. And we've got very good at this. And essentially what I think characterises this is, the theme that, the MA's founded on, which is the rise of science as a form of verification and knowing of the world through asking of, through solving problems. It seeks to provide answers. Whereas I think that as a very general counterbalance, a counterpoint to that, I'd say that the arts really are more about asking questions. And they're really coming into their own right now because we have become aware of the complexity of existence. I would say perhaps acutely culturally since the rise of the internet, and the clash of paradigms and the paradoxes of knowing are becoming very evident to us through this global access to situations and cultures and disciplines. And it's not just an intellectual pursuit that is taking place within the institutions. This is something that we're living every day. So let me just race through a perspective on that. So I followed, so I'm situated in a field called experimental architecture, which is just one of the most wonderful things that I could have been invited to participate in. Experimental architecture is really about the construction of prototypes and instruments to synthesize practices that are knowledge-based, but not necessarily enlightenment constrained, that they will deal with other forms of knowledge. So, for example, forms of knowledge through the body, like the channeling that happens through mediumship or performance art. And how do we actually layer these different knowledge practices together and create a sense of engagement with our, with the world that we're situated in, so that we can actually ask questions that have meaning and provide answers that respond to those. So I think there's a complex choreography that's emerging right now. So the way I've done this is to follow a thought experiment that was originally proposed by Stephen Jay Gould in It's a Wonderful Life, where he asks, he was questioning this paradigm of, let's say, genetic programming being, the selfish gene being the dominant force behind the evolution of living things, which is obviously something that someone like Richard Dawkins proposes, so the near-Darwinist view. And he proposed that if we replay the tape of life, we could establish whether or not the genetic program was king, as it were, was the originator of all form and functionality and all those other things that go into living, or whether there was actually a much greater degree of environmental contingency. But obviously this had to be a thought experiment. And so I followed this and was invited about 3 years ago to participate in a project that was being run by Icarus Interstellar, which is about the construction of a Starship research platform in Earth's orbit within the next 100 years. Now, it's a real project. Okay, so this is not a speculative idea. There's a whole group of international aerospace engineers that are developing things like CubeSats and plans for giant satellite dishes, which are designed to pick up interstellar images or data coming back from places like Alpha Centauri. And my proposal was to see if we could do what Richard Feynman says, actually understand life by actually trying to construct it, but not starting from the origins of life, starting from the beginnings of human civilization by rerunning the tape of human civilization through the synthesis of soils. And so what I'm going to do is just race through a few of these soil experiments. And I'm not defining soil as being a condition of a particular kind of materiality, but actually through its phenomenology, which is a kind of conductor of flow, material flow. And in order to observe that better, I was working with my students to create these transparent soils made out of gels that were being constructed at the chemistry outreach department at Newcastle University, where you can see physical processes like the formation of Liesegang rings create these generative patterns so that, without trying to simplify the construction of soils, how do we actually start to generate complex environments that are not rarefied and abstracted and can be observed and engaged in different ways? So that's a platform. This is another experimental platform, which was in 2010 with Philip Beasley at the Venice Biennale, where I was invited to make a chemical system that responded to the cybernetic framework of Beasley's Hylozoic ground. So Hylozoic meaning life-bearing. And the little yellow dot is a series of organs that I was developing, which take carbon dioxide and turn it into a solid structure, which can form a sculpture that's about the size of your little fingertip. And the challenge here that I was responding to was to take something that was happening at a laboratory level into an architectural scale environment. And we could do that by creating little nests. So there was a spatial choreography with this as a way of scaling up laboratory events and taking them into scales that could start to have a one-to-one dialogue with the human and also with the city. Now, this is actually a biocrete that's spontaneously produced in Venice itself. So we went out into the city of Venice and we observed the structure of the city, which is situated in a medium that really encourages and enables the propagation of life. And here we can see how algae and bacteria and the contaminants in the waterways are actually working together to synthesize a particular kind of rock, a kind of stromatolite, a kind of thrombolite, these living rocks produced by biological interactions. And the idea was to actually use a droplet-based technology, a soft robot, if you like, a chemically programmable system that releases let's say, actuators and activators as a little container to choreograph these sequences of events and effectively grow an artificial limestone reef underneath the city as a condensation of the interactions of people and biology and the city itself. So we equip it with the capacity to respond to environmental change. And this is another one, this is Future Venice 2, looking at how we can use waste materials such as the problematic algae and eutrophication as a way of creating natural nets to trap microplastics. So there are 30,000 plastic bottles that are just hurled into the Venice lagoon every year. And of course they get fractured by this sunlight and turned into these tiny particles that we can't remove through physical means. So the idea was, can we actually get a conversation going as a one-to-one between the microalgae and the plastics? And in fact, we managed to do this in a series of tanks. This is a curated space I was invited to curate for the IDEA laboratory. This is Ecologic's work at the front here. These are smart these are smart sensors that give you an idea about the health of the lagoon. And this is where we're actually getting the biofilm linking to the plastic bottles and essentially producing the conditions in which we may be able to create a functional Earth, a future island that can literally create a habitat where we could cite genetically modified mosquitoes that reduce the mosquito load under the challenges of climate change. This is actually an experiment that was done in the stratosphere, which is looking at what is necessary, what are the conditions for soil, the media of soil, that are necessary to promote the synthesis of different kinds of life or support them in extreme environments? And this is equivalent, very equivalent to that of the Martian environment. And so essentially we had two comparator systems. One was an epiphyte, which doesn't need soil, a plant that can exist in the air. And another one, this is a lifelike chemistry, which I've been working on, called the protocell. I'm quickly going to go through to the Rauschenberg Foundation work, if I can get there fast enough. This is, we sent some cockroaches up as well. This is the fish house at the Rauschenberg Foundation. Again, I was looking at a soil program. These are witch bottles. These are actually looking at knowledge practices that are pre-enlightenment about how we can actually channel our desires, fears, and anxieties as charms to protect the Rauschenberg estate from the impacts of climate change. It's on a barrier island, and therefore it is really exposed to the impacts of rising waters. And within that space, I was also creating work of these golem that are inverted. You know, one's got a fish's tail. We're talking about uncertainty, about transformation, about survival, and they've got long, long legs on them, a bit like War of the Worlds, that is, literally enabling them to creep through the mangroves, which are literally these plants that will walk from the water into the land and purify the environment as they do so. This is moon writing round about the fish house. During certain phases of the moon, you can actually start to see, and it's particularly evident here, the little ripples on the right character, second one down, of how the moonlight is writing a message, maybe a love letter, to the Earth on the surface of the tide, which is greatly influenced by the moon. And then I looked at another heavenly body, Venus. This is the morning star, being a point source. It was so much further away that it gave a different kind of calligraphy or choreography. Reminds me of Merce Cunningham's Life Forms. And then I created a moon instrument that would be able to write back to the moon, using a series of broken mirrors to fracture light and have a conversation. It also articulates with the Handbook of the Unknowable that I did with Rolf Hughes, who should be here somewhere, which again is looking at a different relationship between knowledge, a cosmology that speaks to, let's say, a 21st century form of being. And again, taking some of these instruments into performance environments. This is an instrument based on an ancient practice of scrying with mirrored surfaces that talk about transformation, and working with circus performers to literally, explore these impossible surfaces, where you're actually getting many reflections and refractions and spaces that you don't expect open up in analog, not just as a virtual practice. But I also do a lot of project work. This is a real project that's funded by the EU to a tune of 3.2 million, looking at a living architecture situated in an architectural environment that is programming biofilms, not just individual cells, to literally create metabolic apps within buildings, so that instead of using industrial synthesis, we're actually using biological synthesis to power our living spaces. And this one, this is a project that's in progress. This is the island of Obanion, which is a party island that's just off the coast of Croatia. And they've set up a composting site there. And again, with Rolf Hughes, we'll be looking at bringing artists onto the island to try and create a synthesis between human living and a reinvigoration of the soil. So the actual program is about how does human living actually increase the fertility of the planet. And so these are really talking about, how can we think of a complex world that isn't reduced into sums of its part, that engages with the arts and sciences and many forms of knowing, and that responding to the biggest challenges of our time. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Burning questions for Rachel? Burning questions? I have one. Of course, I always have one stored up in case somebody doesn't. I'm waiting for people to jump up because, is anybody there? No? Yes, one here.
Hi. I think hold on. Okay. Very good. I think that talk and presentation was fantastic and very exciting. But as an architect, you are already crossing that border between art and science. Your training is scientific, and yet you are an artist. You're relying on your brain from the art point of view. Can you see the way the architectural training can help and influence this particular degree course?
I think so. I think there's a marvellous opportunity here. I was really excited to see the presentations this morning. And obviously it's early days. But I really think that there is a context here in which the students and tutors can really interrogate what it means to know. And I think that there's something really, interesting and exciting about the possible fusions here.
Also, can I add that it's also very practical.
Yes.
And economic.
Yes.
And helpful for these young people in terms of seeing routes to make use of these great brains they've got out there.
Yes, and I think that actually practice and making is absolutely part of a mature 21st century form of knowing. I think that the days of just purely intellectualizing and speculating is not enough. I think we have to reconnect with the material.
Thank you, Rachel. We'll pick up on a lot of that during the Q&A. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce somebody who I've never met before lunch. So I'm going to read out her full description, if that's okay with you, Eve. Professor Eve Mitleton-Kelly, is Director of the Complexity Research Group at the London School of Economics, Senior Fellow in IDEAS, the Centre for the Study of International Affairs, Diplomacy and Strategy, Policy Advisor to European and USA organisations, the European Commission, UK government departments, and scientific advisor to the governments of Australia, Brazil, Canada, Netherlands, Singapore and the UK. Her research has concentrated on addressing apparently intractable problems at organizational, national and global levels, and the creation of enabling environments based on complexity science. She has developed a theory of complex social systems and a methodology to address complex problems, and has led and participated in over 30 research projects. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Mitleton-Kelly. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I'm delighted to be here. I don't know whether any of you actually know what complexity science is about. So I'll try and say something about it as I go along. But first of all, I want to start with something very simple. When I was asked to talk about interdisciplinary research, I was delighted because it's a notion which is very close to my heart. Because I've been practicing it for over 20 years, and I will tell you about it in a moment. So as a social scientist, my first degree is in philosophy, but my master's is in information systems. And when I was working with information systems, I actually worked with, believe it or not, anthropologists, engineers, and IT professionals. And I think that was part of my interest in working with other professions that had, on the surface of it, little relationship with what I was doing, but it was very important. When I started working with complexity science as part of my research, then I started working with biologists, with physicists, with mathematicians, with modelers. These are people who build models and simulations. And I will come back again to this and give you some examples. Now, it is fascinating when you are in a room full of physicists, you are the only woman and the only social scientist. It can be a little intimidating, and therefore one has to be quite sort of strong and confident in what one is doing. It's a very interesting discussion to be had, because we discuss similar concepts. They have the same name, but we understand them in totally different ways. And this is part of the process of being interdisciplinary. Because through that debate, this is how you clarify your own ideas and how perhaps you influence others to amend their own. So this is a little bit of my academic background. And the philosophy, I think, was invaluable because it helped me to ask questions. Rachel said that asking questions is so very important, and I agree with that entirely, especially the question why. Why did things happen the way they happen? Okay, let's go back into, I want to make a distinction between multidisciplinarity and the polymath. These were the notions that were offered to me in terms of preparing this presentation. And I think one of the debates we often have is, should we go for breadth or for depth? And I think a lot of science, of course, tends to go for depth. Now, is it necessarily an either or? And I would suggest no. Not necessarily an either or, because we can, in one sense, have both. So how can we have both? We can aim for depth, but at the same time be informed by insights from other disciplines. That is part of the interdisciplinary approach. so that we can actually open to listen, to see. It's the seeing. And as artists, you will understand how important seeing is. Not just seeing an object, but seeing a concept, seeing something which is abstract from a totally different perspective can actually open up your own way of thinking. The multidisciplinary or the polymath is something different. We have an assumption that the one person will bring together those different disciplines. And this may be a little difficult if we again make the assumption that all of them will be at the same depth or same level. And again, I would argue that that is not necessarily the case. We do need to go into great depth in at least one discipline, because that provides us with the idea of how do you actually conduct research? How do you go about exploring a particular topic? But that only gives you the start, the beginning, the building blocks of going into the other disciplines. Okay, so the question again is why? Why should we value something, the multi and the poly? Because it expands, enriches, enhances our way of thinking. Simply because we can see different perspectives. Let me tell you a little about the kind of research we do. First of all, let me explain that we use very different methods and tools. Everything from in-depth interviewing and analysis to building models and simulations, using network analysis, working with psychologists, working with artists. The point is, what we're trying to do is to build up what we call a multidimensional jigsaw puzzle. If you see a problem from one perspective, you cannot actually address it effectively. It is only when you build that richness of perspectives that you begin to actually help to address it. So seeing the different perspectives is very important, because it also leads to what is innovative, what is creative. And I think all of you will probably agree that it is making those connections that you had not predicted or could not have been predictable at the outset. It's that more of the sum of the parts. It is when you are talking with someone and something actually goes in your head and you say, yes, I know now what the issue is. Let me explore it further. And that is the value of the inter, the multi, the polymath. But we need to make distinctions and have clear assumptions as to what we mean by all those things. I want to give you 3 examples. One is the notion of coevolution. The other is working with an artist. And finally, a little bit on the qualitative-quantitative debate. Now, how many of you are familiar with the notion of coevolution? We all are familiar with evolution. How many of you are familiar with the notion of coevolution? Good, at least it's not none. Let me explain. But first of all, let me show you something. This is what one definition from biology. Bumblebees and the flowers they pollinate have co-evolved so that both have become dependent on each other for survival. Now, this is a very strong relationship. It has taken generations, if not centuries, to actually come into being. And it will take equally long to evolve any further. Let us now think of a social context, human systems. Our interactions with others, they do not take centuries. They can be very, very fast, very quick. It took us actually 2 years to understand what does coevolution mean in a human context. It wasn't easy because we kept coming across the very hard definitions of biology. So at this point, let me explain a little about complexity science. What complexity science does is look at relationships. It is the relationships between the entity we are studying and the relationships between that entity and its related entities within its broader context or ecosystem. So we're not focusing only on that entity, that item, that object, but the relationships it has. So it is focusing on those relationships. And always within a context. So let me explain what eventually we came to understand as coevolution in a social context. If I were to take a decision or action that affected you, and you change your behavior as a result of my decision or action, that's simple adaptation. You have adapted to changes in your environment. But if your changed behavior then came back and influenced me to such an extent that I also had to change my behavior, that's reciprocal influence that changes the behavior of the interacting entities. That is coevolution in a human context. Once you have understood that dynamic, you begin to understand what happens in politics, what happens in science, what happens in the arts, what happens in your everyday life, because it is a very, very powerful dynamic. It is how do we influence and influence others in the process, because whatever we do, whatever action we take, it has some influence. And very often people, when I work with organizations, or 5, right, I better carry on then. People say, but we are powerless. No, one is never powerless because of this coevolutionary dynamic. We work with artists. Now, just have a quick look at this. This is a very simple picture, but it captures an awful lot. This was the artist sitting as we were doing our analysis of a set of interviews. Now, what you see there is a highly dysfunctional organization. Now, there was no way that we can actually stand up in front of the CEO and his board of directors and say, you have a very dysfunctional organization. So we put a very large poster of this up while we were having coffee and said nothing about it. We just left them to actually see it, interpret it. To begin with was icy silence. Then somebody laughed. That broke the tension. And that provided us with permission to talk about it and to explain why it was quite so dysfunctional. So working with artists actually has brought an awful lot of value to the work we do. So the outcome is that by working with very, very practical problems, we have developed a methodology and an effective approach to address what we call apparently intractable problems. Now, we identify multiple dimensions in the problem space, the social, the cultural, the technical, the financial, the physical. That's not enough, because all you end up is with an endless list of issues. What we have done is identified the critical co-evolving clusters. These are the issues that influence and affect each other to such an extent that if you do not address them, you can never effectively address the problem. And that's the big breakthrough. And then we see it in terms of co-creating an enabling environment. These problems don't have solutions. What they do, therefore, we need to think about is in terms of creating the environment that will support the constant addressing of the problem. What are the skills, what are the resources, et cetera, needed? And in fact, when we're talking about multidisciplinarity, again, what is the enabling environment that will facilitate that kind of thinking? Because in many contexts, it is actually constrained. Some applications, we've worked in industry, in the private sector, the public, the voluntary, etc. We're working on a project on pandemics and conflict and the World Economic Forum. We recently did a project on gender and decision-making in coastal communities for the UN. We had a very large project on evacuation after a major disaster funded by the European Commission, deforestation in Indonesia, and if you want some more details of any of those, I can give them to you later. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It is absolutely fascinating. What you are all doing is actually applying these ideas. All you haven't got at the moment is the language. So that I hope that eventually you will be able to become familiar, because it will open up a huge dimension for you. Thank you so much.
Eve, as you have a minute left, I just wondered if I could ask you to go back to that model of coevolution on a social level, because I didn't fully quite understand it myself. You say that person A asks person B to change their behavior.
No, you don't ask. You don't ask.
Yeah, okay.
You take a decision or an action,
right,
and through that decision or action, affect someone else, right, or a group of people, okay, and so on. So, say for example, our Prime Minister will has taken a particular action on, for example, asking the question, should we leave the EU? Yeah. Now, that was an initial question that he raised. He took a particular action to say we will have a vote on it. Now, what has happened since is he has affected others to such an extent that they have fundamentally changed their behavior. Mm-hmm. But that changed behavior, if that's all it was, would be just simple adaptation to his initial action. It has now come back and influenced Cameron to such an extent that he is now beginning to rethink his initial original ideas and proposals. It is when it comes back and influences you, and we see that constantly in policy making.
But he just called the referendum to get votes.
No.
Okay.
No, he doesn't. He doesn't. But we should not think of it in those simplistic ways. It is everything else that is associated with it. It is opening up to to exploring the space of possibilities. That's another notion, okay, which is incredibly rich. And so coevolution is really understanding how any of our decisions or actions can have that potential to influence others and their change behavior to come back and influence us in return. It is that reciprocal influence. And as I said, if you see it in policy, if you see it in science, etc., once you start seeing that dynamic, it is astonishing how you can then explain what is happening and understand what is happening.
Right. And is coevolution a good thing?
It is neither good nor bad. It is a process that is neutral. None of these concepts have any ethical attribute. They can be both bad and good. So, for example, we do a lot of work with with networks. Now, you can use a network, as we all do in terms of our social networks, to great benefit. But Al-Qaeda also uses certain topologies of networks to make it very powerful indeed. And in fact, the US has a whole department looking at topologies of networks to try and understand how do you identify those networks because they become then so very difficult to actually address. So it's that sort of thing, really. That's
very interesting. So I grabbed the first burning question. Before we go into the Q&A, does anyone have a specific question for Eve? I'd be really surprised if you didn't. Yes, one here.
Is there? It seems like there should be some rigorous underlying foundation in terms of modelling these systems. Do you find any inspiration from sort of drawing ways of modelling this from nonlinear systems of chaos mathematics?
Yes, I've got one, yes. Absolutely. In fact, chaos and mathematics are part of complexity science. But the key point there is nonlinearity, because the linear systems really do not help us at all, because if you understand how complex systems operate, you understand that they are totally nonlinear. And therefore, we have to use the different nonlinearities to actually understand how they operate. So yes, chaos theory and mathematics are at the heart of it, absolutely.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to call all of the speakers up to the front for a general Q&A. Please, out there, don't be shy. Please raise a limb or a tentacle or an antenna, because I can't see you very well. So please respond. Please, let's have a very dynamic dialogue to finish this wonderful day of unfolding realities. Thank you. And again, I'm going to take the privilege of the first question. Rachel, you talked about the Icarus interstellar. I've just, being a science fiction fan, I've just finished reading Neil Stephenson's Seven Eves, and it's made me think about intergenerationality in research. And one of the things that came across about thinking about Icarus is, of course, you're involved in a project which you will not see in your lifetime. How is that knowledge passed on? How does that process happen, and how does it feel to work on a project you will never see in your own lifetime?
Well, I would totally like to see it complete in my lifetime. I have ambitions to live 100 further years. However, I mean, the Obanion project is also one that spans 44 years because it's got a lease on it. And essentially, it's about creating knowledge structures and processes of experiment and iteration that are transferable. So it's not literally about driving a top-down program through a huge time space, but actually how do we construct that's why I'm so interested in instruments and prototypes, that these are actually navigational instruments that help us move through unknown or unknowable spaces. And so essentially the transference of knowledge is really about the construction of these, let's call them evolving laboratories and instruments, that get passed through the generations.
Thank you. Oron, 100 years of symbiotica. Do you propose to be there?
I don't think so. I'm trying to live 130. But it's kind of interesting, and it's going to co-evolve, for sure. And maybe I should kind of also riff on the idea of coevolution in the context of why I called symbiotica. So, because symbiotic relationship is a subset of parasitic relationship. And there's a very thin line between those things, because something that might be beneficial for you and for the other might then turn around to be biased towards one side or another. So in a sense, symbiotica should really be called parasitica, because we as artists, we populated the scientific world and we're exploiting them. And I don't really care what they're going to benefit out of it, as long as we'll be able to provide this kind of access to those very restricted resources to artists. But by definition, the place where we are integrated in is co-evolving with us. So in 100 years, we might see more smooth relationship, or we might see the parasitic entity taking over, which would be my dream, really.
And in coevolution, can we think beyond our lifetime? I mean, how do you feel about this intergenerational question that I'm bringing up, changing beyond our lifetimes?
Well, obviously. I mean, we're here only a dot. And part of the thing that concerns me, you see, is something like climate change. Because the actions we are taking today are going to affect our grandchildren, great-great-great-grandchildren, and generations to come. And this is part because most people don't understand about coevolutionary dynamics. They don't understand how our actions are actually going to have fundamental effects and changes in the future that will come back and affect us. I mean, we see that all the time, that anthropogenic action is actually affecting our atmosphere, the earth, etc., etc. And somehow we still do not accept that coevolutionary dynamic. And the more people understand about it, the more we might be able to address it more effectively, because climate change is not something we can solve, but I can assure you we can address it much more effectively if we understand the world as a complex system.
And that brings me on again to space travel. I'm wondering, Rachel, just going back, I mean, do you think in 100 years' time we will be forced to abandon the planet for space?
No.
No.
No. I don't think we'll be forced. I think there will be a decision. I think we're actually looking at a very interesting age where we're taking an ecological view of space exploration as opposed to an industrial view, which is about smash and grab and planetary resources. And we're actually starting to think into spaces that are about habitability. So, you know, the synthesis of soils, you know, what we are actually putting back into the places that we are starting to visit is actually becoming part of our mindfulness about doing this.
And so astrobiology and astroecology perhaps is the way to go here.
I think it will be a very interesting discipline to be involved in.
Now, would anybody like to say anything else before we open it up to everybody here?
Yeah, I would like to go into something that Rachel mentioned in regard to the phases of kind of knowledge production, especially through universities. So you were totally right talking about 500 years ago, universities were all about religious studies, and the only thing that operated within the context of the university could only exist within this paradigm. And then the Enlightenment came, and we opened up to this type of knowledge system that you described that is still going on. I would claim that we are now on a cusp of moving to a third one, where, although you might not agree with where I think we're going, but I think that the crisis universities are facing is that they're going back to their traditional role as being religious schools, but this time the god is the market.
Yeah.
And anything that doesn't operate in this paradigm of the market and the neoliberal thinking is falling apart. And that's why we see the lack of support of critical thinking program between universities. So I think that we are on the cusp, and I think this program here in particular would be an interesting one to see if it's going to resist it or going to be seduced or kind of become part of this new paradigm of universities, which is a major, major crisis in human knowledge.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you
Okay,
more.
no,
And I think that someone like Donna Haraway, you know, with her Thulucene, Capitalocene, and Anthropocene, is really starting to kind of create a new conversation into this space.
Yes, and I think, if I may add to both, I think we really do need to think very, very carefully about how our universities create the enabling environment for that kind of thinking, because, you know, we can all see the dangers of that narrowness and isolation, and therefore, how do we facilitate and encourage the broadening rather than the narrowing?
Yeah, but I think there has to be a recognition again that universities are supporting the community at large, and it's not just supporting the individuals who are coming to study. And this is something, you know, coming from Australia, where we're going through this transformation that you went through 10 years ago, I'm scared shitless. It's like,
Okay, well, some of you here may be at a university. In fact, most of you probably are. First question here.
I guess my question's kind of for Oron to begin with, but you talk about identifying problems, and I was wondering if you ever feel compelled to solve any of those problems or any kind of responsibility to do so.
It's a great question, because I see myself as one of the very few remaining privileged people that can only make a living out of identifying problems rather than trying to solve them. And we are a disappearing breed, as we mentioned before, because the new paradigm of education doesn't really allow that to happen as much as it used to. So I actively resist my ideas of trying to solve problems, even when I'm trying to, I suppose, superficially solve problems, like when I grow meat in the lab or grow leather in the lab. It was always to try to identify the problems that's associated with this way of thinking rather than to really trying to genuinely develop a solution to a problem. It was really highlighting. So from my perspective, things like in vitro meat, for example, are a symptom rather than a solution. And by doing so, it helped me understand so much more better why my hunch initially that it was a symptom and not a solution is actually the right way of thinking, in a sense, from my perspective. And you know, and I think that there is a need, and this is kind of, I think, the disappearing role of art. We are in art as a way of thinking is one of the last privileged bastions that celebrate failure. And actually, I made this, you know, I made a career out of failure. I'm constantly failing, but I managed to exist with it. Being able to not give you this warm, fuzzy feeling that seems to be prevalent now, that everything is going to be all right, because it's not going to be all right, and we need to be aware of it. And there's very, very few people that can actually stand up and have a stage where they can tell us that the world is fucked, and there's no way out, and we need to understand it, and we can't continue with business as usual. by trying to give you a warm, fuzzy feeling that I'm somehow going to find you a solution for something, I'm going to betray the very same foundations that my whole practice is based on.
Can I take that a step further? Because I think what you just said about what is a symptom and what is a cause is fundamental. Because if you don't make that distinction, if you don't understand the real underlying multiple causalities of a problem, you simply cannot address it. Because if all you're addressing is the symptom, you will keep on actually doing the wrong thing. And that is why you cannot ever address it effectively. And therefore, understanding, identifying that multidimensional problem space is essential, because until you understand the multiple interacting causalities and how they influence each other, how they co-evolve, again, you don't stand a chance of addressing a complex problem. And I can give you, several examples if you wish to as to how we applied that in practice. But that is the key. That is fundamental. Understanding that you cannot simply go solve a problem or address it effectively by looking at what is apparent, what is obvious, but you need to go very deeply and not a single cause, because no complex problem has a single cause. That's too linear. There are multiple underlying interacting co-evolving causalities.
You have one over there.
So I want to make a question to all of you. Like, maybe you can answer in a very briefly, in a briefly way. Like,
I can't hear you. Can you hold it closer?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm
That's
gonna
better.
make you to a question to all of you. Like, it's a specific situation that is happening in the Caribbean. So maybe if you were able to answer in a very briefly way, or since the point of view of each of you, for example, we've been talking about climate change and the relationship between species in the world, like humans, nature, animals. So it is a case it's an island in the Caribbean that is shared by two countries. In one of these countries, there is a lake, and inside this lake is a little island with a very important group of endemic species, endemic from the island in the lake, they are not shared, they are isolated from the rest of the island. So the lake start to flood very slowly, flood all the area around and the island itself. So I don't know how many time it will take, but the little island, it will flood. So it's just I want to know, from a symbiotic point of view, or a co-evolution point of view, or experimental architectural point of view, what do you think? How you think this issue could be approached?
You're saying basically there's an endemic species that is going to totally disappear without any intervention whatsoever, and you'd like the panelists to comment on that?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a really interesting philosophical question, because it's about the idea of intrinsic value. Those endemic species, obviously, if they're going to disappear, nothing much in the world is going to change. So it's about us somehow giving those organisms a symbolic value which is intrinsic to their existence that no other organism in the world share, and we need to kind of relate to that. Now, saying that, we need to remember that biological systems, by definition, are dynamic and destructive. It's not human invention. Nature is not this nice harmonic kind of system. It's constantly destroying and it's constantly rebuilding. So us trying to preserve things which have intrinsic value because humans choose to put a value onto those systems might not be where we should really spend our time or our energy or our interest in. So in a sense, it's a very much an aesthetic decision, which as an artist, I'm totally relating to it, and I think that, we can engage with it, but somehow putting a value on those systems that would benefit them over other systems that might be more prevalent, but in a sense, if you want to take some kind of a utilitarian ethical perspective, the suffering that might result from their existence might be greater than the suffering that this endemic species that would disappear would go through.
Just to make that clear, endemic means it only exists there, rather than indigenous. Just for people who don't.
But, but just let me put it in another thing. There is now a growing number of initiatives to try and collect samples of organisms that are disappearing and freezing them as an insurance policy. So there's the Frozen Ark project that is a consortium of natural history museums and zoos around the world. And actually, in my perspective, and obviously I didn't really have time to talk about it, a lot of my work recently deals around this fetishization of technological approaches to life. And the Frozen Ark is one of the greatest examples of this type of fetishization of life removed from context being preserved as a data set, or even just as DNA sequence or stem cells, with the illusion that we might be able to restart it in some stage in the future, while everything else within the dynamic system of life on Earth would shift and change. So in this case, it's a mute type of exercise.
It's a symbol of the Anthropocene, though, that we are the only way these things are being preserved is by human intervention.
Yeah, I would argue that they're not really preserved. It's a symbolic gesture that results out of our fetishization of those technological approaches of decontextualized life for us to feel good about ourselves, but in a sense, we're not preserving anything.
You're saying they don't work?
I think that no, they don't. They're actually worse than work. They don't work. They encourage us to feel that there is a solution, going back to this idea that there is a way out of it. There is an undo button that we'll be able to somehow press.
But seed banks work, for example. Seed banks work.
To some extent, they are, but it's again, it's a human construct. The seeds that we collect are rarely seeds of some kind of an endangered species that has no economic value.
Anybody want to question that? Because that's quite an interesting position. I mean, yeah. There, Paul.
Well, I have a question, but it's not necessarily specific.
But maybe you should respond to that question. I think that's...
Yes.
Did you want to respond to that first? My question was not necessarily one step to the side of that.
Yes, I don't know, so maybe Rachel and Eve should respond to.
I would actually carry on, yes.
One of the things that we discussed at the Rauschenberg Foundation was this question of graceful migration, because that's going to happen to Captiva Island. We're going to lose the barrier island and some of the unique native species of pheasants. So I think Oren's completely right about, what is it that's at stake? Where is our value system in relationship to that? And then, what are the courses of action that we, as an identified community, feel is necessary to take? And at the moment, I think that our challenge is that everything seems to boil down to, as you said, the god of economics. If it's a species that brings in revenue, then we are likely to go out of our way to do what we would call conservation, which in itself is a very political and highly contested intervention. And in terms of the graceful migration, what that was about really is actually that there seem to be factors that are not just incidental that keep us in very dangerous situations. So, for example, the state of the city of New Orleans is, in a particular situation where there is a point at which the city can no longer exist because of the rising waters. And yet there are kind of political and economic and geopolitical constraints on how people buy houses, how the land is insured, the notion of place, sense of community. This isn't just a single factor. That we really do have to reconstruct what is of value to us in this particular time. And I think that what we're seeing with this MA is, we're starting to mobilize those streams of thought, but they're not easy.
No, they're not. And in fact, I would disagree with you that it is an aesthetic notion. I would make it an ethical notion and agree with you in terms of the value. But what I would wish to understand is why would we want to actually save those particular species? What is it within the broader context that they can add that value? Because and then understand what is it that we can actually do or not do. Because it could well be that we simply allow them to flood, but if the decision is taken that no, they do need to be saved, then we need to be incredibly creative. And at the moment, I find we are not very creative at exactly how we actually save those species. You've given us some very interesting examples, but I think we need to go beyond those and to think much more creatively in terms of what happens in the future. So I cannot offer you an answer until I look into it into much, much greater depth and understand what is happening there and why. The big question why.
Maybe we can all discuss that over drink.
Yeah.
Paul's intervention and then one more, and then I think we're going to have to wind up soon. Paul.
Okay, well, it was really about the discussion being about quantitative behaviour and qualitative behaviour to some extent for me.
Oh, yes.
And then the sort of ruptures that you need to shift that, and then your measurement devices. So your measurement devices seem to become part of the problem rather than part of the solution. So you're taking all these things for as though some sort of point or some sort of measurement can answer some of these questions. And we know now that measurements are false. We know that scientific measurements are corrupt, and we know that they're based on our own tools for solving our own problems. We create the tools and devices to do that. And so it seems to me that we have to actually shift as humans a lot further into a qualitative way of approaching things and let go of some of this quantification of the world. And so I just want your thoughts on that.
Okay. Right. Can I start on that? Because this is a debate I have been working with for many years. I would say it is not a shift from the quantitative to the qualitative. It is a shift to having both, because each one contributes a different way of thinking to actually understanding what the issues are. So I would give great importance and emphasis on my qualitative work, but I know perfectly well that when a mathematician or a modeler works with me, he or she will bring certain perspectives that I simply are not open to me from a purely qualitative perspective. So I would say it's working together, is bringing both together and having that dialogue between the quantitative and the qualitative disciplines to create that new language where we understand both and bring both together to contribute their own particular understanding to the problem we're trying to address.
Yeah, and I would add, I would move beyond the idea of the modern laboratory, and I think that if you look back at New Atlantis, which was the second slide that I shown, that the idea was that the modern city was actually built around a laboratory. So, so you could see the communication systems, genetic modification, all these things that characterize the modern city. So that gives us a clue that if we actually want to change the valuations of practices, maybe we need to start exploding this idea of what is a laboratory, what is an experiment, where are our laboratories, and how do we start to conduct these experiments, and what are these instruments? Are there instruments or kind of, let's call them prototypes, or whether they're, organizations that help us create spaces for new ideas? Maybe this is where we need to be focusing some of our attention. But I think it's about stacking all these things and not saying, oh, well, this is the age now where we get rid of data, or this is where we go touchy-feely. And it's how do we work them all?
I've been told we've run out of time. You have the last word.
Well, it follows on from there, I think, and also from Ava's exhortation for us to be more creative in our thinking. And so my question is really partly to do with dialogue and partly to do with what is excluded from practices. I was struck by Rachel's description of Future Venice 2 being a dialogue between microalgae and the 30,000 bottles that are sort of disintegrated in the water there in order to produce benevolent sort of outcomes. And there was also, in the terminology you've been hearing all day, biological arts, MA in art and science, Ava's presentation, which has a sort of multiplication of terms for different ways of talking together or working together, inter, poly, multi, and so on. In each time, it strikes me there's a coupling of practices, and what I'm really interested in is what is excluded from your practices that you might wish to include in it.
That's a very good question.
I noticed witchcraft for one, but might magic be included?
Yeah. That seems to be very much a theme that's coming up this year in lots of exhibitions and conferences. Yeah, witchcraft. Who wants that one?
So what is excluded?
What is excluded, yeah.
I think what is excluded is, let's say, a lack of critical thinking. There has to be some iteration and criticality about the observations. Yes. So I would say blindness and just a kind of a recklessness towards research is not the way to go.
Absolutely.
Not frivolous.
I would agree, yeah.
And this is what we're losing. But
yes.
If I may, when I select residents for Symbiotica, for example, I get quite a lot of witchcraft-related applications that I need to reject because I'm based in a scientific department, and I have to make those choices. Really, the way we choose people is based on how well we feel they're going to exploit those very limited resources we made available for them. But we can't have someone that their existence there would basically shut down our operation. I get so many applications of people that just by the virtue of us being based in the science department feel that they can come in and somehow validate whatever non-scientific or pseudo-scientific notion they have, and thinking that artists would be the conduit to go in. Those are the no-go places. And I'm not apologizing about that.
How could you study the non-rational from a rational point of view, or is that impossible?
Sorry, say that again.
How can you look at the non-rational from a rational point of view within a scientific context, or are we saying it's impossible?
It's a great question, because first of all, we need to acknowledge, and this is one of the mistakes of the Enlightenment,
that's right.
We need to acknowledge that we are not rational.
Exactly.
So,
but we're not irrational either. It's irrational. I think it's understanding that rationality is not the only logic. But irrationality is not its opposite. There is something that is irrational, which I think we need to understand. And I would say one way is for every single student to have some training in philosophy, to be able to ask those fundamental questions in whichever discipline they are in, because it's asking those fundamental questions that is key.
So irrational is a word we can take away with us today. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for the great questions, and thank you to the panel.
Thank you, everyone. Am I on? Yes. So to try and tie up things neatly from this conference would be countercultural, because the very premise of what we're doing is ecologies of thoughts and interconnections between different forms of knowing. So I will leave you to ruminate on the many, many issues and questions and problems that have been raised today. Carry on the discussion. If you wish, they've set up a pop-up bar for us in the canteen directly opposite. So please do join us to continue the conversation. The degree show is open until 6 p.m. today and between 12 and 6 tomorrow, and then it'll come down. And our students who will graduate will go off on their interdisciplinary travels elsewhere. Thank you so much to Rob for moderating this afternoon, to our three distinguished speakers. Not extinguished, distinguished. That's another conversation. To the student speakers this morning, and on behalf of Nathan and I from the course, thank you very much for coming.